Hello, weary traveler of the modern world. Wherever you find yourself tonight, perhaps curled beneath soft blankets in a quiet bedroom, or sitting in a favorite chair as the day's last light fades from your window, I want you to know that you are welcome here. In this gentle space we're creating together. Is it late where you are? Can you hear the distant hum of traffic, or perhaps the settling sounds of an old house finding its rest? Take a moment to notice the comfort that surrounds you, the warmth of your shelter, the softness of whatever supports your tired body, the simple miracle of clean water flowing from taps whenever you need it. If this voice brings you some small measure of peace tonight, perhaps you'll consider joining our little community of fellow wanderers who find solace in the forgotten stories of the past. There's something deeply comforting about remembering that countless generations before us have faced their own darkness and somehow found ways to carry on. We'll explore these stories together, you and I, in the quiet hours when the world grows still. Tonight, I want to take you on a journey through time, back to an empire that once stretched across the known world, where marble gleamed white against Mediterranean skies and the sound of flowing water echoed through great stone chambers. But this is not a tale of glory or conquest. Instead, we'll wade into the murky depths of daily life in ancient Rome, into spaces where bodies gathered in ways that would shock and disturb our modern sensibilities. We'll discover together why the Roman baths, those monuments to cleanliness and civilization that we so admire in our history books, held secrets that were far from pristine. Picture, if you will, the most revolting, disturbing, and utterly shocking truth about one of history's most celebrated institutions. The Roman thermae, magnificent temple-like structures dedicated to bathing and social gathering, were not the sparkling oases of cleanliness they appeared to be. Beneath their marble surfaces and behind their grand facades lay a reality so filthy, so teeming with disease and decay, that it would make a modern person recoil in absolute horror. The waters that Romans praised as healing and purifying were, in truth, cesspools of human waste, bodily fluids, and rotting matter. The very institution that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of Roman civilization was built upon a foundation of such profound uncleanliness that it defies imagination. Every day, thousands upon thousands of unwashed bodies would descend into these communal waters, bringing with them the accumulated grime, sweat, and waste of their daily lives. But the horror goes deeper still. In a world without understanding of germs or bacteria, without proper filtration or sanitation, these baths became breeding grounds for diseases so terrible that they could kill within days. Skin infections that would eat away at flesh, intestinal parasites that would slowly starve their hosts from within, and respiratory ailments that would drown people in their own fluid-filled lungshole. Of these horrors flourished in the warm, stagnant waters that Romans believed would make them clean. This is the forgotten truth, the dark reality that history has glossed over with romantic notions of Roman sophistication. Tonight, we'll descend into those ancient waters together, not as tourists admiring ruins, but as witnesses to the daily suffering of ordinary people who had no choice but to bathe in what amounted to open sewers disguised as temples to cleanliness. Close your eyes now and let your mind drift backward through the centuries. Feel yourself sinking through layers of time until you emerge, blinking, into the harsh Mediterranean sunlight of the 2nd century after Christ. You are standing on a cobblestone street in the heart of Rome, the greatest city the world has ever known, and yet the first thing that strikes you is not its grandeur, but its smell. The air is thick with odors that assault your senses, the sharp temps of urine from the fulleries where cloth is cleaned, the sweet sick smell of rotting fish from the markets, and underneath it all, the constant, underlying stench of human waste that seems to permeate every stone, every building, every breath of air you take. The sun beats down mercilessly on your head, and you realize that your skin is already beginning to feel sticky with sweat and grime. You are dressed in a simple tunic, the rough wool scratching against your skin, and you notice how the fabric seems to hold onto odors, the smell of smoke from cooking fires, the mustiness of damp rooms, the acrid scent of your own unwashed body. Around you, the streets teem with people, and you become acutely aware of how they smell too. Bodies that have known only occasional washing, teeth blackened with decay, hair greasy and matted with weeks of accumulated oil and dirt. The gutters that run along the edges of the streets are filled with a brown, fetid mixture that you dare not examine too closely. And the sound of your sandals on the wet stones creates small splashes that make you pull your tunic higher. Flies buzz constantly around you, landing on your face, your hands, your lips, drawn by the sweetness of human sweat and the promise of decay that seems to hang in the air like a visible fog. But ahead of you rises something magnificent, structure so grand and imposing that it seems to promise escape from all this filth. The great thermae of Caracalla stretch before you like a marble mountain, its walls soaring high above the squalor of the streets, its entrance beckoning with the promise of cleanliness, of civilization, of relief from the oppressive dirt that coats your skin like a second layer of clothing. To understand the true horror of what awaits you in those marble halls, you must first grasp the world from which these baths emerge, the empire built upon conquest and slavery, where the vast majority of people lived in conditions that would shock even the poorest communities of our modern world. Rome, in the 2nd century, was home to over 1 million souls crammed into a space that could barely contain them, creating a density of human habitation that had never before been seen on Earth. The great majority of Romans lived in insulate towering apartment buildings that rose 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories into the smoky air, their upper floors swaying dangerously in strong winds. These buildings were constructed hastily and cheaply, with walls so thin that you could hear every conversation, every argument, every intimate moment of your neighbors' lives. The ground floors might house shops or slightly more prosperous families, but as you climbed higher, the conditions grew progressively worse. In the uppermost floors, entire families crowded into single rooms that measured perhaps 10 feet by 12. Spaces so small that beds had to be shared not just by husband and wife, but by children, elderly relatives, and sometimes even boarders who paid a few coins for the privilege of sleeping on the floor. Windows, if they existed at all, were mere holes in the wall covered by wooden shutters that kept out wind and rain, but also blocked any hope of fresh air or natural light. There was no running water above the ground floor. Every drop that was needed for drinking, cooking, or washing had to be carried up flights of rickety wooden stairs in heavy clay vessels, a back-breaking task that fell mostly to women and children. The wealthy might employ slaves for such work, but for the vast majority of Romans, water was a precious commodity that had to be hoarded and carefully rationed. Waste disposal was equally primitive and revolting. Chamber pots were emptied from upper-story windows directly into the streets below, creating a constant rain of human excrement that pedestrians learned to dodge with practiced skill. The lucky might have access to communal latrines on the ground floor of their building, but these were often nothing more than wooden planks with holes cut in them, positioned over open sewers that flowed directly beneath the living spaces. The insulae had no heating except for small charcoal braziers that filled the cramped rooms with choking smoke and created a constant risk of fire. In winter, families huddled together for warmth, their breath visible in the freezing air, their fingers too numb to perform even simple tasks. In summer, the upper floors became furnaces where the heat was so intense that people could barely breathe, and the smell of so many unwashed bodies in such close quarters became almost unbearable. Disease spread through these overcrowded spaces like wildfire. Tuberculosis consumed the lungs of the poor with terrible efficiency, while dysentery turned their bowels to water and left them weak and dying. Smallpox left survivors scarred and sometimes blind, while the sweating sickness could kill a healthy person in a single day. Children died so frequently that parents often waited years before giving them names, knowing that attachment would only make the inevitable loss more painful. And yet, in the midst of this overwhelming squalor, the Romans built their baths, massive, glorious monuments to the idea of cleanliness that drew people from across the empire. To understand the cruel irony of what these places became, you must follow the daily ritual that brought hundreds, sometimes thousands of people into contact with waters that were anything but pure. You join the crowd that streams toward the thermae in the early afternoon, when the sun has had time to warm the vast chambers and the fires beneath. The floors have brought the water to the perfect temperature. The entrance fee is modest quadrans, a small bronze coin that even a poor person might afford once or twice a week, but for many, this represents a significant portion of their income, a sacrifice made in the desperate hope that the waters might wash away not just dirt, but also the diseases and infections that constantly threaten to overwhelm their weakened bodies. As you approach the entrance, the smell hits you first, not the clean, chlorinated scent of a modern swimming pool, but something far more complex and disturbing. It's sweet and putrid at the same time, like flowers left too long in stagnant water, mixed with the unmistakable odor of human bodies in various states of decay and disease. Steam rises from the building's windows and doorways, carrying with it the concentrated essence of thousands of people's bodily functions. Inside, you are directed to the appetiterium, the changing room, where you must remove your clothes and store them in small niches cut into the walls. But there are no locks, no security, and theft is so common that many people simply accept that they will leave with different clothes than they entered with, if they are lucky enough to leave with clothes at all. The floor is slick with condensation and other fluids you prefer not to identify, and your bare feet slip and slide as you try to maintain your balance. The first stop in the bathing ritual is the tepidarium, the warm room, where you are supposed to prepare your body for the hotter baths to come. But the warmth here comes not just from the heated floors, but from the press of human bodies. People standing so close together that you can feel their breath on your neck, their sweat mingling with yours in the humid air. The walls are covered with a film of moisture that runs in constant rivulets down to the floor, carrying with it the accumulated exhalations and secretions of everyone who has passed through this space. Slaves move through the crowd with oil and strigils curved bronze scrapers used to remove dirt and dead skin from the body. But these tools are shared among dozens of people without any cleaning between uses, carrying infections and parasites from person to person with ruthless efficiency. The oil itself, stored in large communal vessels, becomes contaminated within hours of being opened, its surface covered with a rainbow film of bacteria and fungal growth that shimmers in the lamplight. From the tepidarium, you move to the caldarium, the hot room, where the real horror begins. Here, the temperature is so intense that the air shimmers like a mirage, and the marble floors are heated from below by furnaces that burn constantly, consuming enormous quantities of wood and filling the air with acrid smoke. The heat is meant to open your pores, to prepare your body for the cleansing that is to come. but instead it creates the perfect environment for bacteria to multiply and infections to spread. The hot pool itself is a vision from a fever dream. The water, which should be crystal clear, is instead a murky brown-green soup that seems to move with a life of its own. This movement comes not from any filtration system, for such things do not exist, but from the constant circulation of people entering and leaving, stirring up sediment from the bottom and creating currents of contaminated water that swirl around your body as you attempt to bathe. The temperature of the water, maintained at what the Romans considered a perfect heat, is actually the ideal breeding ground for harmful microorganisms. In this warm, nutrient-rich environment, bacteria multiply at an exponential rate, creating colonies so dense that they form visible clouds in the water. Every breath you take fills your lungs with steam that carries these microscopic invaders, while every moment your skin remains submerged allows them to find new ways into your body through cuts, scrapes, and the natural openings that exist in even healthy skin. But the true horror lies in what the water contains. This is not simply dirty water, this is water that has been contaminated by the bodily functions of hundreds of people who have no understanding of sanitation or hygiene. People with open wounds bathe alongside those with infectious diseases. Children who have soiled themselves are cleaned in the same water that others drink. Adults with festering sores and running ulcers share the space with pregnant women and the elderly, creating a toxic mixture that would challenge even modern medicine. The Romans have no concept of germs or bacteria. They believe that disease is caused by imbalances in the body's humors, by bad air, or by the displeasure of the gods. They see the murky water not as a sign of contamination, but as evidence of the bath's therapeutic power. The darker the water, the more impurities it must be drawing from their bodies. This tragic misunderstanding leads them to seek out the most polluted pools, believing that the filthiest water will provide the greatest healing. Around the edges of the pool, you notice strange growths clinging to the marble greenish-black colonies of algae and fungus that thrive in the constant moisture and warmth. These organisms release spores into the air and toxins into the water, adding another layer of danger to an already deadly environment. The Romans sometimes scraped these growths away, but without proper disinfection, they return within days, more vigorous than before. As you move through the caldarium, your eyes begin to adjust to the steam and dim lighting, and you start to notice the other bathers more clearly. What you see fills you with a horror that goes beyond mere disgusted, is the horror of witnessing human suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. To your left, an elderly man sits on the marble steps leading into the pool, his skin covered with what appear to be small, weeping sores. He moves slowly, each gesture clearly causing him pain, but he continues to lower himself into the contaminated water, believing that it will heal him. The sores on his body are not healing, however, they are spreading, growing larger and more inflamed with each exposure to the bacteria-laden water that he trusts to cure him. Near the center of the pool, a young woman holds a small child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, whose breathing is labored and whose skin has a grayish pallor that speaks of serious illness. The child coughs constantly, a wet, rattling sound that echoes off the marble walls, and with each cough, droplets of infected saliva spray into the water around them. The mother, desperate to help her child, keeps dunking the small body beneath the surface, not realizing that she is potentially drowning her child in a soup of pathogens that will only make the illness worse. Across the pool, a group of slaves tends to their master, a wealthy merchant whose obesity speaks of a life of excess, but whose yellowed skin and swollen belly suggests that his indulgences have come at a terrible cost. His slaves, themselves thin and scarred from lives of hard labor and poor nutrition, carefully lower their master into the water, their own bodies bearing the marks of diseases that they have no hope of treating. One slave, a young man who might have been handsome under different circumstances, has a persistent cough that brings up blood, staining the water around him with thin red streamlets. The social hierarchy of Rome is on full display here, but in the democracy of disease, status means nothing. The patrician, with his carefully groomed beard, suffers from the same intestinal parasites as the plebeian laborer. The senator's wife, adorned with jewelry even in the bath, has the same skin lesions as the prostitute who works the taverns near the docks. The water that touches one touches all, carrying infections and infestations from body to body without regard for wealth, position, or birth. You watch as people emerge from the water, their skin temporarily clean but already carrying within their bodies the seeds of new illnesses. Some will develop fevers within hours. Others will suffer from digestive ailments that will leave them weak for weeks. A few will contract infections so severe that they will die within days, never understanding that the very place they went for healing became the instrument of their destruction. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all are the children. Roman society, for all its sophistication in law and engineering, has no understanding of pediatric medicine or the special vulnerabilities of young bodies. Children are brought to the baths by parents who genuinely believe they are providing the best possible care, but who are instead exposing their offspring to dangers that their small immune systems cannot possibly fight off. You see a boy of perhaps 8 years old, his ribs clearly visible through his thin skin, struggling to keep his head above water while his father scrubs him vigorously with a coarse cloth. The child's eyes are dull with fever, and his breathing is shallow and rapid. Each breath he takes draws more contaminated steam into his developing lungs, while the aggressive scrubbing opens tiny wounds in his skin that provide perfect entry points for infection. The final stage of the bathing ritual takes you to the frigidarium, the cold room where you are supposed to plunge into icy water to close your pores and complete the cleansing process. The Romans believed that this dramatic temperature change will lock in the benefits of the hot bath, sealing their newly clean bodies against future contamination. In reality, the shock of the cold water on bodies already weakened by heat and infection often proves to be the final assault that pushes people over the edge from illness into death. The cold pool is fed by the same aqueduct system that supplies the rest of the baths, which means that while the water is cooler, it is not necessarily cleaner. The lower temperature does slow the growth of some bacteria, but it also creates ideal conditions for other types of pathogens, particularly those that cause respiratory infections. The sudden immersion in cold water after the intense heat of the caldarium places enormous stress on the cardiovascular system, and it is not uncommon to see bathers collapse and die on the spot, their hearts simply unable to cope with the dramatic change. But even for those who survive the immediate shock, the frigidarium presents its own unique dangers. The cold water causes blood vessels to constrict rapidly, reducing circulation to the extremities and internal organs. For people already weakened by disease or poor nutrition, this reduction in blood flow can be catastrophic, causing organs to shut down or wounds to become gangrenous. As you lower yourself into the frigid water, you feel your muscles contract violently, your breath coming in sharp gasps that echo off the domed ceiling. Around you, other bathers are going through the same ordeal, their faces contorted with shock and pain. Some emerge quickly, unable to tolerate the cold, while others force themselves to remain submerged, believing that endurance will somehow multiply the health benefits. The marble steps leading into the frigidarium are slick with condensation and algae, creating treacherous footing for people whose coordination has been affected by the extreme temperature changes. Falls are common, and the hard marble surface shows no mercy to those who slip. You see an elderly woman struggling to maintain her balance, her arthritic joints clearly causing her agony in the cold water. But she persists, perhaps knowing that this may be her last chance to experience what she believes is healing. The contrast between the frigidarium and the caldarium creates a cycle of thermal shock that places enormous stress on the immune system. Bodies that are already fighting infections find their resources depleted by the constant need to regulate temperature, leaving them even more vulnerable to the diseases that flourish in the contaminated water. What the Romans intend as a strengthening ritual becomes, instead, a systematic weakening of their body's natural defenses. Surrounding the main bathing areas, the thermae function as a complete social complex, with areas for exercise, massage, food service, and general socializing. But each of these spaces contributes its own horrors to the overall contamination of the facility. The palestra, where people engage in athletic activities, becomes a breeding ground for fungal infections as sweaty bodies come into contact with equipment that is shared by hundreds of people without any cleaning. The massage rooms, where slaves work oil into the skin of their masters, become vectors for the transmission of skin diseases. The same hands that touch infected sores on one client move directly to the next customer, carrying parasites, bacteria, and fungal spores from body to body. The oils used for massage, stored in communal containers and applied with reused cloths, become contaminated within hours and serve as perfect breeding grounds for pathogens. Even the areas where food and drink are served contribute to the cycle of contamination. The cups and bowls are washed, if at all, in the same water that people bathe in, while the food itself is often prepared by slaves who have no access to clean water for washing their hands. Gastrointestinal diseases spread rapidly through these communal meals, adding digestive misery to the respiratory and skin ailments that people acquire from the baths themselves. The social aspect of the baths, which Romans prize so highly, becomes another mechanism for spreading disease. People gather to gossip, conduct business, and arrange marriages, standing close together in the humid air, breathing directly on one another, sharing drinks from common cups, and embracing in greeting without any understanding of how diseases pass from person to person. The very sociability that makes the baths so attractive to Romans ensures that any outbreak of illness will spread rapidly through the community. You watch as a group of men discuss politics while sharing a jug of wine, each taking a drink directly from the vessel before passing it to the next person. One of them has a persistent cough, another shows signs of jaundice, and a third has what appear to be early symptoms of tuberculosis. But they continue their animated conversation, spraying saliva and infected breath over everyone in their vicinity. Women gather in similar groups, their conversations punctuated by the sounds of children playing in the shallow pools designed for their use. But these children's pools are perhaps the most contaminated of all, as young ones have not yet learned to control their bodily functions and frequently soil the water, creating a concentrated mixture of human waste and infectious agents that poses particular dangers to other children whose immune systems are still developing. The very design of the Roman baths, so admired by architects and historians, actually contributes to the spread of disease in ways that the builders never could have imagined. The high domed ceilings that create such dramatic acoustic effects also trap humid air filled with pathogens, creating a greenhouse effect that maintains perfect conditions for bacterial growth. The beautiful marble surfaces, while visually impressive, are porous enough to harbor microorganisms in their tiny cracks and crevices, ensuring that contamination persists even when the pools are drained and refilled. The heating system, considered one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, creates temperature gradients that actually encourage the growth of different types of harmful organisms in different areas of the building. The hypercost system that heats the floors from below creates warm, moist spaces beneath the bathing areas where bacteria and fungi flourish, occasionally releasing clouds of spores through cracks in the marble that bathers inhale directly into their lungs. The aqueducts that supply the baths with fresh water are marvels of engineering, but they also serve as highways for waterborne diseases. Contamination that enters the system at any point can travel for miles, affecting multiple bath complexes and potentially thousands of people. The lead pipes used in the plumbing, while durable and easy to work with, slowly poison the water supply, causing neurological damage that manifests as madness, infertility, and developmental disorders in children. The drainage systems, designed to carry away used water, often become blocked or damaged, causing contaminated water to back up into the clean pools, without any understanding of hydraulic pressure or backflow prevention. Roman engineers inadvertently created systems that could rapidly spread contamination throughout an entire facility. When these backups occur, the most polluted water from the drains mingles with the fresh water from the aqueducts, creating a toxic mixture that poses dangers even the Romans cannot ignore. The ventilation systems, such as they are, consists primarily of openings in the walls and ceiling that allow some circulation of air, but these same openings also allow insects to enter the building. Flies, mosquitoes, and other disease-carrying creatures find the warm, humid environment of the baths ideal for breeding, and they move freely between the contaminated pools and the people bathing in them, carrying pathogens from person to person and from one area of the facility to another. Ironically, the Romans have created an entire class of bath attendants and managers who are responsible for maintaining these facilities. But their efforts, while well-intentioned, often make the contamination worse. These attendants, mostly slaves or freedmen with no formal training in sanitation, follow traditional practices that have been passed down through generations without any scientific understanding of their effectiveness. The process of cleaning the pools involves draining them periodically and scrubbing the surfaces with sand and olive oil. But without any disinfectant, this process simply redistributes contamination rather than eliminating it. The sand used for scrubbing is often taken from beaches or riverbanks where it has been contaminated with human and animal waste, while the olive oil, mixed with the accumulated grime from the pools, creates a paste that is spread over every surface, leaving behind a film that actually encourages bacterial growth. The attendants themselves, working in the contaminated environment day after day, become carriers of multiple diseases that they unknowingly spread to the bathers they serve. They handle the oils and implements used for massage and scraping, moving from person to person without washing their hands, serving as living vectors for the transmission of skin diseases, parasites, and infections. Some bath attendants specialize in medical treatments, offering to treat various ailments with hot water, cold water, or special oils and poultices. But their medical knowledge is based on superstition and tradition rather than any understanding of disease, and their treatments often worsen the very conditions they are meant to cure. A person with a skin infection might be treated with oils that trap bacteria against the skin, while someone suffering from respiratory problems might be subjected to steam, treatments that drive infected moisture deeper into their lungs. The economic incentives of the bath system actually work against cleanliness and safety. The more people who use the facilities, the more profit the owners make. So there is constant pressure to pack as many bodies as possible into the available space. Water is expensive to heat and transport, so pools are not changed as frequently as they should be, and when they are drained, they are often refilled before the cleaning process is complete. Bath attendants are paid based on the number of customers they serve, not on the quality of care they provide. So they rush through treatments and reuse equipment without proper cleaning. The pressure to maximize profit means that sick people are rarely turned away, and there are no systems in place to quarantine those with obviously contagious diseases. As you spend more time observing the patterns of the baths, you begin to notice how the cycle of contamination changes with the seasons, each bringing its own particular horrors and challenges. Winter, when the contrast between the heated baths and the cold outside air is most extreme, sees an increase in respiratory ailments as people's bodies struggle to adapt to the dramatic temperature changes. The pools remain warm, but the changing rooms and outer areas of the complex become brutally cold, creating conditions where pneumonia and other lung infections flourish. The winter months also bring increased crowding as people seek refuge from the cold streets in the warmth of the baths. This crowding intensifies the spread of disease, as more bodies mean more contamination in the same amount of water. The air becomes so thick with steam and breath that visibility is reduced to just a few feet, and the concentration of airborne pathogens reaches levels that would be considered lethal by modern standards. Spring brings its own challenges as melting snow and spring rains overwhelm the city's primitive drainage systems, causing contaminated water to back up into the aqueducts that supply the baths. The warmer weather encourages the growth of bacteria and parasites that have been dormant during the winter months, and the pools become breeding grounds for organisms that cause dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases. Summer is perhaps the worst season of all for the baths. The extreme heat makes the caldarium almost unbearable, while the cooler pools become refuges for people seeking relief from the blazing sun. But this increased usage, combined with the higher temperatures that accelerate bacterial growth, creates conditions that are truly hellish. The water becomes so contaminated that it takes on a greenish tinge, and the smell becomes so overwhelming that even the Romans, accustomed as they are to the odors of their city, begin to notice and complain. During the summer months, outbreaks of disease spread through the bath communities with terrifying speed. A single person with cholera or typhoid can contaminate an entire facility within hours, and the disease spreads from there to families, neighborhoods, and eventually throughout the city. The hot weather also increases the insect population, and swarms of flies descend on the baths, carrying diseases from the contaminated pools to food preparation areas and living spaces throughout Rome. Autumn brings temporary relief as temperatures moderate and the worst of the summer's contamination begins to subside. But it also brings the harvest season, when people from the countryside flock to Rome to sell their goods and conduct business. These rural visitors, unaccustomed to the concentrated filth of urban life, are particularly vulnerable to the diseases that circulate through the bath system, and many become ill and die far from home, their bodies contributing to the growing piles of corpses that must be disposed of by the city's overwhelmed burial system. Of all the tragedies that unfold daily in the Roman baths, perhaps none is more heartbreaking than the fate of the children who were brought there by parents desperate to keep their families healthy. Roman society, despite its many achievements, has no concept of pediatric medicine or the special care that children require, and the baths become death traps for the young and vulnerable. Infants, who should be protected from exposure to contaminated water, are often brought to the baths within days of birth. Roman mothers, following traditions passed down through generations, believe that early exposure to the waters will strengthen their children and protect them from future illness. In reality, the newborns' undeveloped immune systems are completely overwhelmed by the bacterial assault, and many die within hours of their first bath. Their tiny bodies, unable to fight off infections that would challenge even healthy adults. Older children fare little better. Their natural curiosity leads them to explore every corner of the bath complex, putting their hands and mouths on surfaces that are crawling with parasites and bacteria. They play games in the contaminated pools, splashing and diving with no understanding of the dangers that surround them. Their games often involve drinking the bath water or diving to the bottom of pools to retrieve coins thrown by adult bathers, exposing them to concentrated doses of the most contaminated water in the facility. The symptoms of waterborne illness in children are particularly cruel. Young bodies dehydrate quickly when struck by dysentery, their small reserves of fluid depleted within hours. Respiratory infections that might merely weaken an adult can kill a child within days, as their smaller airways become blocked with infected fluid. Skin diseases that cause discomfort in adults can become systemic infections in children, spreading throughout their bodies and causing organ failure. Parents, watching their children suffer, often increase their visits to the baths, believing that more exposure to the healing waters will eventually cure their ailments. This tragic logic leads to a cycle of reinfection that ensures that sick children never have a chance to recover. Each visit to the baths exposes them to new strains of bacteria and parasites, preventing their immune systems from gaining any ground against the diseases that are slowly consuming them. The bath attendants, recognizing the particular vulnerability of children, sometimes offer special treatments designed specifically for the young. These treatments, based on folk wisdom and superstition rather than medical knowledge, often involve prolonged immersion in the hottest water or the application of oils and poultices that trap bacteria against the child's sensitive skin. Children who might have survived their initial infections are often killed by these well-intentioned but medically ignorant treatments. Roman law provides little protection for children in the baths. Slaves who are children have no rights at all and can be subjected to any treatment their owners deem appropriate. Even free children are considered the property of their fathers, who have absolute authority over their medical care. This legal framework means that there is no oversight or regulation of how children are treated in the baths, and no recourse for families whose children are harmed by negligent or ignorant bath attendants. The Roman bath system exists within a complex economic structure that actually incentivizes the spread of disease and contamination. The baths are businesses designed to generate profit for their owners, and every aspect of their operation is governed by the need to maximize revenue while minimizing costs. This economic reality creates a system where public health is consistently sacrificed for private profit. The admission fees charged by the baths are kept deliberately low to attract the maximum number of customers. But this low-price, high-volume model means that the facilities are constantly overcrowded and undermined. Water, heating fuel, and cleaning supplies are expensive, so corners are cut wherever possible. Pools are not changed as frequently as they should be. Cleaning is done hastily and inadequately, and equipment is used far beyond the point where it should be replaced. The labor force that maintains the baths consists almost entirely of slaves, who have no stake in the quality of their work and no power to refuse dangerous or unsanitary tasks. These slaves, working in contaminated environments without any protective equipment or medical care, become living repositories of disease that they spread throughout the facilities and beyond. When they become too sick to work, they are simply replaced with new slaves, and the cycle continues. The Roman government, despite its sophisticated legal system and administrative structure, has no regulatory framework for overseeing public health in the baths. There are no inspections, no standards for water quality or sanitation, and no penalties for operators who maintain facilities that pose dangers to public health. The government actually profits from the bath system through taxes and fees, creating a conflict of interest that prevents effective regulation even when problems become obvious. The medical profession, such as it exists in Roman society, actually benefits from the diseases spread by the baths. Physicians charge fees for treating the ailments that people contract in the contaminated waters, creating a perverse incentive system where the medical establishment has no motivation to advocate for cleaner facilities. Some physicians even recommend regular bathing as a treatment for various ailments, unknowingly sending their patients to the very source of their suffering. The supply chains that support the bath system are themselves vectors for contamination. The olive oil used for massages and cleaning is transported in containers that are rarely properly cleaned, allowing bacteria and parasites to survive long journeys from distant provinces. The sand used for scrubbing is often harvested from areas where human and animal waste has accumulated, while the cloths and implements used for cleaning are manufactured in workshops where sanitation is non-existent. Even the architectural materials used in bath construction contribute to the spread of disease. The marble, while beautiful, is often quarried from sites where workers suffering from respiratory diseases have contaminated the stone with their infected breath and saliva. The lead pipes that carry water throughout the facilities slowly poison everyone who uses them, while the mortar used to bind the stones together is mixed with water that may already be contaminated. The economic pressures of running a profitable bath operation mean that maintenance is always deferred until problems become impossible to ignore. Cracked pipes that allow sewage to mix with clean water are patched rather than replaced. Damaged drainage systems that cause contaminated water to back up into clean pools are temporarily diverted rather than properly repaired. These short-term fixes create long-term health hazards that affect thousands of people but are invisible to the customers who continue to pay their entrance fees. In the shadowed corners and marble alcoves of the great thermae, a thriving economy of exploitation has taken root, feeding like a parasite upon the desperate hopes of the sick and dying. Here, in spaces that should echo with the sounds of healing and restoration, instead ring the voices of merchants hawking their wares to people whose judgment has been clouded by suffering and whose purses have been emptied by desperation. The oil vendors arrive each morning before dawn, their clay amphorae filled with substances they claim possess miraculous healing properties. These oils, extracted from olives grown in distant provinces, have traveled for weeks in containers that have never been properly cleaned, picking up contamination from every port and warehouse along their journey. The vendors themselves, often carrying diseases contracted from handling countless contaminated vessels, dip their unwashed hands directly into the oil to demonstrate its supposed purity, unknowingly introducing new pathogens with each gesture. The most expensive oils are said to come from sacred groves blessed by particular gods, their prices reflecting not their actual quality but the desperation of buyers, who believe that divine intervention might succeed where earthly medicine has failed. A small vial of oil claimed to be from the Grove of Diana might cost a poor family their entire monthly income, leaving them without money for food while they anoint their dying child with what amounts to rancid vegetable oil mixed with bacteria and false hope. Perfume sellers work the crowds with even greater cynicism, claiming that their fragrances can mask the smell of disease and thereby prevent its spread. Romans, believing that bad air causes illness, eagerly purchase these aromatic concoctions, not realizing that the heavy scents simply cover up the warning odors that might otherwise alert them to sources of contamination. The perfumes themselves, mixed with contaminated water and stored in unclean containers, often cause skin reactions and respiratory irritation that weaken the body's natural defenses against more serious diseases. The massage oil trade represents perhaps the most direct vector for disease transmission in the entire bath complex. The same oil that is used on a person with festering sores is then sold to the next customer, who has no way of knowing the history of the substance being rubbed into their skin. The massage implements, bronze scrapers, ivory combs, wooden rollers pass from customer to customer without any cleaning, carrying with them skin cells, bodily fluids, and parasites from everyone who has used them. Vendors of medicinal herbs set up small stalls near the entrances to the bathing areas. Their goods spread out on cloths that have absorbed moisture and contamination from the humid air. These herbs, many of them imported from distant lands where different diseases are endemic, introduce new pathogens to the Roman population while claiming to cure existing ailments. The preparation of herbal remedies using contaminated bathwater creates potions that are often more dangerous than the illnesses they purport to treat. The food vendors who serve the hungry bathers present their own unique dangers. Without refrigeration or any understanding of food safety, they offer meals that have been sitting in the warm, humid air for hours, growing cultures of bacteria that will add gastrointestinal distress to whatever other ailments the bathers may be suffering from. The bread, often days old and showing signs of mold, is served alongside wine that has been watered down with liquid drawn directly from the pools. Perhaps no group suffers more terribly in the Roman bath system than the slaves who are forced to work in these disease-ridden environments day after day, their bodies serving as living laboratories for every pathogen that passes through the facility. These men, women, and children, considered property rather than people, have no choice but to expose themselves to dangers that would send free citizens fleeing in terror. The bath attendants, mostly young men purchased specifically for their physical strength and appearance, find their health deteriorating rapidly under the constant assault of contaminated water and infected air. Their duties require them to spend entire days with their hands and arms submerged in the polluted pools, scrubbing and cleaning surfaces that can never truly be made clean. The skin on their hands and forearms develops a characteristic roughness and discoloration that marks them as bath workers, while chronic respiratory infections leave them with persistent coughs that grow worse with each passing month. These attendants are expected to assist bathers with every aspect of the bathing ritual, from applying oils to operating the strigils that scrape away dead skin and accumulated dirt. But the same hands that touch diseased and infected bodies move immediately to the next customer without any opportunity for cleaning or disinfection. A slave who spends his morning helping a person with advanced syphilis will spend his afternoon working with children and pregnant women, unknowingly carrying deadly pathogens from one vulnerable population to another. The female slaves who work in the women's sections of the baths face particular horrors, as they are required to assist with intimate hygiene procedures that expose them to the most concentrated sources of bacterial contamination. These women, often barely more than children themselves, must clean and prepare the bodies of customers suffering from gynecological infections, venereal diseases, and other conditions that make their work not just unpleasant, but genuinely life-threatening. The children who work as oil bearers and message runners face perhaps the cruelest fate of all, their small bodies still developing and lacking the immune resistance that comes with age. are completely overwhelmed by the bacterial assault they encounter in the baths. Many develop chronic conditions that will plague them for their entire shortened lives, while others simply succumb to infections within their first few months of work. The economic incentives of the slave system ensure that sick workers are simply replaced rather than treated. A slave who becomes too ill to work effectively is sold to gladiator schools, sent to work in mines, or simply abandoned to die on the streets. This constant turnover means that there is never any institutional memory of which practices might be dangerous or which areas of the baths pose particular health risks. The sleeping quarters provided for bath slaves are typically located in the basement levels of the facilities, where humidity from the pools above creates perfect conditions for the growth of mold and fungus. These dark, damp spaces, often flooded with contaminated water when drainage systems fail, serve as breeding grounds for respiratory diseases that spread rapidly through the crowded slave quarters. The diet provided to bath slaves consists mainly of scraps and leftovers from the food served to paying customers, much of it already spoiled or contaminated. This poor nutrition, combined with the constant exposure to disease, creates a population of workers whose immune systems are so compromised that they serve as ideal hosts for every pathogen that enters the facility. As evening approaches and the light filtering through the high windows begins to fade, the bath complex becomes the stage for elaborate religious ceremonies that are meant to sanctify the waters and ensure their continued healing power. But these rituals, performed with sincere devotion by priests who genuinely believe in their efficacy, actually introduce new sources of contamination while creating social pressures that make it impossible for people to avoid exposure to the polluted waters. The evening libations begin with processions of white-robed priests carrying ceremonial vessels filled with wine, oil, and sacred water drawn from temples throughout the city. These substances, considered pure and holy in their original contexts, become contaminated the moment they are poured into the pools, where they mix with the accumulated filth and bacteria to create a toxic soup that is somehow considered more sacred than it was before. The ritual bathing of sacred objects presents particular dangers, as statues, ceremonial weapons, and religious artifacts that have been stored in damp temple basements are immersed in the pools, releasing clouds of mold, spores, and bacterial contamination that have been growing on their surfaces for months or years. The priests, believing that they are purifying these objects, actually turn them into vectors for the spread of respiratory diseases and skin infections. The communal prayers that accompany these ceremonies require participants to stand chest-deep in contaminated water while chanting in unison, their voices echoing off the marble walls and their breath creating visible clouds of moisture in the humid air. These prayer sessions can last for hours, during which hundreds of people remain immersed in water that grows, progressively more contaminated as more participants join the ritual. The sacrificial offerings made during these ceremonies introduce organic matter that serves as food for bacterial growth. Flowers, fruits, and even small animals are cast into the pools as gifts to the gods, where they quickly begin to decompose in the warm water, creating ideal conditions for the proliferation of harmful microorganisms. The priests, interpreting the rapid decay of these offerings as evidence that the gods are eagerly consuming them, encourage even larger and more frequent sacrifices. The ritual cleansing of newborn infants, considered essential for their spiritual development, exposes the most vulnerable members of society to concentrated doses of contamination. These tiny bodies, lacking any immune resistance, are often fatally infected within hours of their ceremonial immersion, but their deaths are attributed to divine will rather than to the polluted water that actually caused them. The seasonal festivals bring even larger crowds to the baths, creating levels of contamination that exceed anything seen during normal operations. During the Festival of Neptune, thousands of people crowd into pools designed to accommodate hundreds, creating human density that makes disease transmission virtually inevitable. The Festival of Hygeia, ironically dedicated to the goddess of health, typically results in massive outbreaks of waterborne illness that spread throughout the city in the weeks following the celebration. In the steamy chambers, where suffering echoes off marble walls, a class of medical practitioners has emerged who sincerely believe they are combating disease, while actually accelerating its spread through treatments based on theories that are not just wrong but actively harmful. These physicians, trained in the classical traditions and holding positions of respect in Roman society, approach the challenge of bath-related illness with confidence that is matched only by their ignorance of the true causes of the diseases they attempt to treat. The theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile leads these well-meaning doctors to prescribe treatments that often worsen the very conditions they are meant to cure. A patient suffering from what we would recognize as bacterial dysentery is diagnosed with an excess of yellow bile and prescribed prolonged immersion in the hottest available water, where the high temperature accelerates bacterial growth, and the patient's dehydration becomes life-threatening within hours. The practice of bloodletting, considered the most effective treatment for a wide range of ailments, is performed using bronze instruments that are shared among multiple patients without any cleaning between uses. The physicians, believing that removing corrupt blood will allow the body to generate healthy replacement blood, unknowingly introduce new infections through contaminated cutting tools, while weakening patients who are already struggling to fight off waterborne diseases. The diagnostic methods employed by these physicians rely heavily on the examination of urine, which patients are required to provide in containers made of lead-glazed pottery that leaches toxic metals into the samples. The physicians, tasting these urine samples to assess the balance of humours, regularly poison themselves with heavy metals while gaining no useful information about their patients' actual conditions. The surgical procedures performed in the bath complexes represent perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Roman medical practice. Operations are conducted in rooms adjacent to the pools, where the air is thick with contaminated steam and the surfaces are coated with moisture that harbors dangerous bacteria. Surgical instruments are sterilized by rinsing them in the same polluted water that fills the baths, ensuring that every incision introduces new pathogens directly into the patient's body. The post-surgical care prescribed by these physicians involves packing wounds with materials soaked in bath water, believing that the healing properties of the thermal springs will accelerate recovery. Instead, these dressings serve as delivery systems for bacterial infections that often prove more deadly than the original injuries or illnesses that brought patients to surgery in the first place. The training of new physicians takes place largely in the bath complexes, where students observe and assist with treatments while breathing contaminated air and handling infected materials without any protective equipment. These apprentice doctors, their health compromised by constant exposure to disease, often develop chronic conditions that affect their judgment and manual dexterity, ensuring that the next generation of physicians will be even less capable than their predecessors. The pharmaceutical preparations used by bath physicians are mixed using contaminated water and stored in containers that are never properly cleaned. These medicines, even when they contain ingredients that might actually be beneficial, become vectors for disease transmission rather than instruments of healing. The most expensive and highly regarded remedies are often the most dangerous, as they are prepared with elaborate rituals that involve multiple contaminated substances. The magnificent structural design of the Roman thermae, celebrated throughout history as a triumph of engineering and artistic achievement, reveals itself under closer examination to be a carefully constructed instrument of disease transmission. Every architectural decision, from the soaring domes to the intricate floor mosaics, contributes to the creation of an environment that maximizes the spread of contamination while maintaining the illusion of grandeur and healthfulness. The great central halls, with their dramatic arched ceilings and imposing columns, are designed to inspire awe and create a sense of participating in something grand and important. But these same architectural features create acoustic conditions that amplify and distribute the sounds of human suffering, the constant coughing, retching, and labored breathing of people whose bodies are under assault by waterborne pathogens. The echoes that bounce off the marble surfaces carry with them droplets of infected saliva and mucus, ensuring that airborne diseases spread rapidly throughout the facility. The intricate mosaic floors, masterpieces of artistic achievement created by skilled craftsmen using thousands of tiny pieces of colored stone and ceramic, are laid with countless crevices and joints where bacteria and parasites can hide and multiply. These beautiful patterns, admired by visitors and historians alike, cannot be properly cleaned with the crude tools and methods available to Roman slaves, ensuring that contamination persists even when the pools themselves are drained and scrubbed. The heating system known as the hypercaust, that marvel of Roman engineering that circulates hot air through spaces beneath the floors, creates temperature gradients that encourage the growth of different types of harmful microorganisms in different areas of the building. The hot, humid spaces beneath the marble floors become breeding grounds for anaerobic bacteria that thrive in oxygen-poor environments, occasionally releasing clouds of toxic gases through cracks and joints in the flooring. The water distribution system, with its network of lead pipes and bronze fittings, slowly poisons everyone who uses the facility through the gradual leaching of heavy metals into the water supply. The lead pipes, chosen for their durability and ease of installation, release toxic ions that accumulate in the bodies of regular bathers, causing neurological damage that manifests as personality changes, cognitive decline, and reproductive problems. The drainage systems, designed to carry away used water, frequently become blocked with the accumulation of hair, dead skin, soap residue, and other organic matter that builds up over time. When these blockages occur, contaminated water backs up into the clean pools, creating sudden spikes in bacterial concentration that can overwhelm even healthy immune systems. The Roman engineers, lacking any understanding of hydraulic principles, created systems that are inherently prone to these dangerous backflows. The windows and ventilation openings, placed to provide natural light and air circulation, actually serve as entry points for disease-carrying insects and other vectors. Mosquitoes, flies, and other creatures that breed in stagnant water find the warm, humid environment of the baths ideal for reproduction, and they move freely between contaminated pools and human hosts, carrying pathogens throughout the facility and beyond into the surrounding city. As evening approaches and the light filtering through the high windows of the thermae begins to fade, you witness the daily rituals that mark the end of the bathing day. But these ceremonies, meant to honor the gods and ensure continued health and prosperity, are themselves sources of contamination and disease that add yet another layer of horror to the already nightmarish reality of Roman bathing. The libations poured into the pools as offerings to Neptune and other water deities introduce wine, oil, and food into water that is already teeming with bacteria. These organic materials provide additional nutrients for harmful microorganisms, accelerating their growth and creating new strains of pathogens that are even more dangerous than those that existed before. The flowers and herbs scattered on the water's surface as part of religious ceremonies quickly decay in the warm, contaminated environment, releasing toxins that cause skin irritation and respiratory problems. The incense burned during evening prayers fills the humid air with smoke that carries not purification, but additional particulate matter that inflames already infected lungs and sinuses. The priests who perform these ceremonies, moving from pool to pool with their censers and ritual implements, unknowingly carry diseases from one area of the baths to another, their sacred duties making them unwitting agents of contamination. Some of the evening rituals involve the sacrifice of small animals, doves, chickens, sometimes lambs whose blood is allowed to flow into the pools as an offering to ensure the continued flow of healing waters. But this blood, rich in nutrients and often carrying diseases from the sacrificial animals, creates an ideal breeding ground for bacteria that cause sepsis and blood poisoning. Bathers who enter pools shortly after these sacrifices expose any open wounds on their bodies to direct contact with contaminated animal blood. The communal prayers, recited by groups of bathers, create acoustic conditions that encourage the spread of airborne diseases. Dozens of people standing close together, chanting in unison, generate clouds of infected droplets that hang in the humid air and are breathed in by everyone present. The rhythmic nature of the chanting causes people to breathe more deeply than usual, drawing contaminated air deeper into their lungs and increasing their exposure to tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other respiratory ailments. During certain religious festivals, special ceremonies are held in the baths that draw even larger crowds than usual. These celebrations, which can last for hours, involve prolonged immersion in pools that become progressively more contaminated as the evening progresses. The excitement and physical exertion of the ceremonies cause people to breathe more rapidly and sweat more profusely, increasing both their output of contaminants and their uptake of pathogens from the water and air around them. The religious significance attached to the bathing ritual makes it virtually impossible for people to avoid exposure even when they suspect that the waters might be harmful. To refuse to participate in the communal bathing would be seen as an offense against the gods, a rejection of Roman civilization itself. This social and religious pressure ensures that even people who have observed the connection between bathing and illness continue to expose themselves and their families to contamination as darkness falls over Rome and the legitimate bathers return to their homes. The thermae take on an even more sinister character. The night hours bring a different class of clientele: the desperate, the diseased, and the destitute who cannot afford the daytime fees, or who are too sick to be welcomed during regular hours. These midnight bathers bring with them the accumulated filth and disease of the city's darkest corners, turning the already contaminated pools into cesspools that would challenge the imagination of the most creative torturer. Prostitutes, many of them already suffering from the advanced stages of syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases, use the cover of darkness to ply their trade in the warm, private alcoves of the bath complex. Their infected bodies leave trails of pus and blood in the water, while their clients, often drunk and careless, spread these diseases further through the community. The combination of warm water, darkness, and desperate need creates conditions where the most dangerous pathogens can spread with terrifying efficiency. Criminals and outcasts, banned from the baths during daylight hours emerge after sunset to seek relief from their own suffering. These individuals, living rough on the streets without access to clean water or medical care, carry diseases that have progressed far beyond what is normally seen in civilized society. Their presence in the pools introduces strains of bacteria and parasites that have had time to mutate and develop resistance to the body's natural defenses. The night shift of bath attendants consists of the least skilled and most desperate slaves, individuals who are considered unfit for daytime service due to their own health problems or behavioral issues. These attendants, working by the flickering light of oil lamps, cannot see the full extent of the contamination they are dealing with, and their efforts at cleaning are even less effective than those of their daytime counterparts. During the midnight hours, the heating systems that maintain the water temperature are often allowed to decline, creating pockets of cooler water where different types of pathogens can flourish. These temperature variations create thermal currents that distribute contamination throughout the facility in new and unexpected ways, ensuring that no area remains unaffected by the night's accumulation of filth and disease. The darkness also conceals the disposal of human waste that occurs throughout the night. People too sick or drunk to leave the pools relieve themselves in the water, while others use the shadows to dump chamber pots and other containers of excrement into the pools. By morning, the water that greets the first legitimate bathers of the day is a concentrated solution of human waste, bodily fluids, and bacterial contamination that has been brewing in the darkness for hours. The security arrangements for the nighttime hours are minimal, consisting of a few guards who are often drunk or asleep at their posts. This lack of supervision allows people with obviously contagious diseases to enter the facility without any screening, and there is no oversight of the activities that take place in the darkened corners of the complex. The guards themselves, exposed to the same contaminated environment as everyone else, become carriers of disease that they spread throughout the city during their off-duty hours. In the dim morning light that filters through the steam-clouded windows of the thermae, you encounter another layer of the horror that surrounds Roman bathing culture, the army of self-proclaimed healers, physicians, and miracle workers who prey upon the desperation of the sick and dying. These individuals, ranging from well-meaning but ignorant practitioners to outright charlatans, have built their livelihoods around the suffering that flourishes in the contaminated waters of the public baths. The legitimate physicians of Rome, trained in the classical traditions inherited from Greece, approach the baths with theories that are fundamentally flawed but sincerely held. They believe that disease is caused by imbalances in the bodies for humus blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black biland, that these imbalances can be corrected through the application of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. This theoretical framework leads them to prescribe treatments that often worsen the very conditions they are meant to cure. A patient suffering from what we would recognize as bacterial pneumonia might be subjected to prolonged sessions in the steamiest areas of the caldarium, where the physician believes the hot, moist air will help rebalance the patient's humors. In reality, this treatment drives infected moisture deeper into the lungs, while exposing the patient to additional bacteria and fungi that thrive in the warm, humid environment. The patient's condition deteriorates rapidly, but the physician, seeing this decline, often prescribes even more intensive heat treatments, creating a downward spiral that frequently ends in death. The surgical procedures performed in and around the baths are particularly horrifying to observe. Roman surgeons, working without any understanding of antiseptic technique, perform operations using instruments that have been cleaned by rinsing them in the same contaminated water that fills the pools. Wounds are packed with materials soaked in bathwater, introducing bacteria directly into the surgical site and virtually guaranteeing that infections will develop. Bloodletting, one of the most common medical treatments of the era, is performed using shared instruments that carry diseases from patient to patient. The blood that is drawn is often allowed to flow directly into the pools, where it mixes with the contaminated water and provides additional nutrients for bacterial growth. Patients who survive the bloodletting procedure often succumb to infections contracted through the contaminated instruments or from exposure to the polluted environment where the treatment is performed. The herbalists and potion makers who frequent the baths compound their remedies using water drawn directly from the pools, believing that the healing properties of the bath water will enhance the effectiveness of their medicines. These preparations, contaminated from the moment they are mixed, often cause more harm than the original ailments they are meant to treat. Patients who drink these potions ingest concentrated doses of bacteria and parasites, while topical applications introduce infections through the skin. Perhaps most tragic of all are the desperate families who spend their last coins on treatments from traveling miracle workers, who claim to possess secret knowledge or divine favor. These charlatans, recognizing the profound desperation of people watching their loved ones suffer and die, offer elaborate rituals and expensive potions that they claim will cure any ailment. Their treatments, which often involve prolonged immersion in the most contaminated areas of the baths, serve only to accelerate the dying process while enriching the practitioners who perform them. The magnificent architecture of the Roman thermae, celebrated throughout history as a triumph of engineering and design, reveals itself in the harsh light of medical reality to be a carefully constructed instrument of suffering. Every arch, every dome, every carefully planned sightline contributes to the creation of an environment that maximizes the spread of disease while maintaining the illusion of health and civilization. The great central halls, with their soaring ceilings and dramatic columns, are designed to inspire awe and make bathers feel that they are participating in something grand and important. But these same architectural features create acoustic conditions that amplify the sounds of coughing, retching, and other symptoms of illness, filling the air with a constant symphony of suffering. The echoes that bounce off the marble walls carry with them droplets of infected saliva and mucus, distributing airborne pathogens throughout the facility with ruthless efficiency. The intricate mosaic floors, masterpieces of artistic achievement, are laid with thousands of tiny pieces of stone and ceramic that create countless crevices where bacteria and parasites can hide. These mosaics cannot be properly cleaned with the crude tools and methods available to Roman slaves, ensuring that contamination persists even when the pools themselves are drained and scrubbed. The beautiful patterns that visitors admire are literally built upon foundations of accumulated filth and disease. The heating system, that marvel of Roman engineering known as the hypercaust, creates temperature gradients that encourage the growth of different types of harmful microorganisms in different areas of the building. The spaces beneath the floors, where fires burn constantly to heat the rooms above, become breeding grounds for anaerobic bacteria that thrive in hot, oxygen-poor environments. These organisms occasionally release clouds of toxic gases through cracks in the floor, causing respiratory distress and neurological symptoms in people who breathe them. The water distribution system, with its network of lead pipes and bronze fittings, slowly poisons everyone who uses the facility. The lead leaches into the water supply, causing neurological damage that manifests as personality changes, cognitive decline, and eventually death. The bronze fittings, corroding in the constant moisture, release copper ions that accumulate in the liver and brain, causing organ failure and mental illness. The drainage systems, designed to carry away used water, frequently become blocked with the accumulation of hair, dead skin, and other organic matter that builds up over time. When these blockages occur, contaminated water backs up into the clean pools, creating sudden spikes in the concentration of harmful bacteria. The Roman engineers, lacking any understanding of hydraulic principles, have created systems that are prone to these backflows, ensuring that contamination spreads rapidly throughout the facility whenever maintenance problems occur. The windows and ventilation openings, placed to provide light and air circulation, actually serve as entry points for insects and other disease vectors. Mosquitoes, flies, and other creatures that breed in stagnant water find the warm, humid environment of the baths ideal for reproduction, and they move freely between the contaminated pools and the people bathing in them. The ventilation system, rather than clearing contaminated air from the building, often simply circulates it more efficiently, ensuring that airborne pathogens reach every corner of the facility. As the months cycle through their eternal pattern, each season brings its own particular variety of horror to the Roman baths, creating a calendar of contamination that ensures year-round misery. For those who depend on these facilities for cleanliness and health, the seasonal variations in temperature, humidity, and human behavior combine to create different types of disease outbreaks that sweep through the bathing community with predictable regularity. Winter transforms the baths into steam-filled chambers where visibility drops to mere inches and the air becomes so thick with moisture that breathing becomes laborious. The contrast between the heated interior spaces and the frigid Roman winter creates condensation that drips constantly from the ceilings, carrying with it accumulated bacteria and fungi that have grown in the warm, moist spaces above. This contaminated condensation falls directly onto the heads and bodies of bathers, introducing pathogens through the eyes, nose, and mouth. The winter months also see an increase in the burning of braziers and other heating devices to supplement the hypocaust system, filling the already humid air with smoke and particulate matter that inflames respiratory passages and makes people more susceptible to lung infections. The combination of contaminated water vapor and toxic smoke creates an atmosphere that would be considered lethal by modern standards. But Romans, desperate to escape the cold, continue to crowd into these poisoned chambers. Spring brings the return of warmer weather and the resumption of trading activities that have been suspended during the winter months. Merchants and travelers from distant provinces flood into Rome, bringing with them diseases that have been developing in isolation throughout the cold months. The baths become mixing chambers where local Roman diseases encounter foreign pathogens, creating new hybrid strains that are more virulent and deadly than either parent variety. The spring rains that Romans welcome as a relief from winter's cold also overwhelm the city's primitive drainage systems, causing sewage to back up into the aqueducts that supply the baths. The fresh water that enters the pools during spring months often carries the accumulated waste of entire neighborhoods, creating concentrations of bacterial contamination that exceed anything seen during the rest of the year. Summer presents the greatest challenges of all, as temperatures soar and the already minimal sanitation systems of the city break down completely under the stress of extreme heat. The pools that once seemed refreshing become cauldrons of bacterial growth, their temperatures rising to levels that would kill most beneficial microorganisms while allowing the most dangerous pathogens to flourish unchecked. During the hottest months, the mortality rate among bathers increases, dramatically as people suffering from heat exhaustion and dehydration are unable to fight off the infections they contract in the contaminated water. The combination of high temperatures, extreme humidity, and bacterial contamination creates conditions that overwhelm even healthy immune systems, and the pools become littered with the bodies of people who have died while seeking relief from the heat. Autumn brings temporary respite from the worst of summer's horrors, but it also ushers in the harvest season, when Romans consume large quantities of wine and rich foods that compromise their immune systems and make them more vulnerable to waterborne diseases. The combination of impaired judgment from alcohol consumption and weakened resistance from dietary excess leads to increased risk-taking behavior in the baths. As people ignore obvious signs of contamination and danger, as our long journey through the horrors of Roman bathing culture draws toward its close, we must confront the ultimate tragedy that surrounds these monuments to misguided civilization. The very institutions that Romans believed represented the pinnacle of human achievement were slowly but surely contributing to the decline of the empire itself, weakening the population through constant exposure to disease and creating conditions that made recovery and renewal impossible. The demographic impact of the contaminated bath system cannot be overstated. Generations of Romans grew up with compromised immune systems, their bodies constantly fighting off infections contracted in the public baths. Children who survived their first exposures often suffered from chronic ailments that left them weak and unable to contribute fully to society. The most vulnerable members of the population, the elderly, the poor, and the already sick, were systematically eliminated by a system that claimed to promote health and longevity. The economic costs of the bath-related diseases were staggering, though Romans never understood the connection. Vast resources that could have been devoted to genuine improvements in sanitation, medicine, or infrastructure were instead poured into the construction and maintenance of ever more elaborate bathing facilities. The irony is overwhelming. An empire that could build roads spanning continents and aqueducts carrying water hundreds of miles could not manage to keep its bathwater clean. The intellectual decline that historians have noted in later Roman civilization may well have been accelerated by the neurological effects of lead poisoning from the bath systems. The cognitive impairment caused by chronic lead exposure affected decision-making at every level of society, from individual families choosing whether to bring their children to the baths, to government officials planning public health policy. The very people who should have recognized and addressed the problems were suffering from metal poisoning that clouded their judgment and impaired their reasoning abilities. The military implications were particularly severe. Roman legions, recruited from a population that had been systematically weakened by generations of exposure to contaminated water, found themselves increasingly unable to match the physical prowess of barbarian tribes whose members had not been subjected to the civilized horrors of urban bathing. The decline in Roman military effectiveness that marked the later empire may have had its roots in the seemingly benign institution of public bathing. But perhaps most tragic of all was the psychological impact of a system that promised healing but delivered death. Romans lived with the constant anxiety of knowing that their attempts to maintain health and cleanliness might actually be hastening their demise. This knowledge, largely unconscious but deeply felt, contributed to a sense of fatalism and despair that permeated late Roman culture and made adaptation and reform seem impossible. The great baths themselves became symbols of this psychological burden. These massive structures, requiring enormous investments of labor and resources to maintain, stood as monuments to human folly, beautiful, impressive, and ultimately deadly. The Romans could not abandon them without admitting that their entire approach to civilization was fundamentally flawed. But neither could they continue to use them without accepting ongoing suffering and death. And so, dear traveler through time, we find ourselves at the end of our journey into the dark waters of ancient Rome. Having witnessed horrors that the original bathers could never have imagined, and suffering that they could never have understood, as you prepare to return to your own time, to your own clean bed and safe shelter, take a moment to reflect on what we have seen together in these past hours. The Romans who built these magnificent baths were not evil people. They were human beings like ourselves, trying to create lives of dignity and comfort in a world that offered precious little of either. They built their baths with the best knowledge they possessed, guided by traditions that had served their ancestors and theories that seemed reasonable given their understanding of the world. Their failure was not one of intent, but of knowledge. They simply could not see the microscopic enemies that turned their temples of cleanliness into chambers of death. In our modern world, we have the luxury of understanding what they could not. We know about bacteria and viruses, about sanitation and public health, about the invisible forces that can turn healing into harm. This knowledge brings with it a profound responsibility to remember that our own certainties may prove as flawed as theirs, and that future generations may look back on our practices with the same mixture of pity and horror that we feel when contemplating the Roman baths. The Romans believed they were civilized, and by the standards of their time, they were. They built cities that housed millions, created legal systems that lasted for centuries, and constructed monuments that still inspire awe today. But their civilization, like all civilizations, was built upon foundations that were not as solid as they appeared. The same waters that they believed cleansed their bodies were slowly poisoning their society, creating weakness where they sought strength and death where they sought life. There is a profound humility to be found in this recognition. We too live in a civilization that we believe represents the pinnacle of human achievement. We have our own institutions that we trust implicitly, our own practices that seem obviously beneficial, our own blind spots that prevent us from seeing dangers that may be hiding in plain sight. The Romans' faith in their baths should remind us that confidence in our own systems, however well-founded it may seem, should always be tempered with humility and openness to evidence that challenges our assumptions. But there is also hope in this story. The Romans eventually learned, though slowly and at great cost, that their baths were dangerous. Later, civilizations developed better methods of sanitation and water treatment. Building on the hard-won knowledge that came from observing the consequences of contamination, the suffering we have witnessed tonight was not meaningless. It became part of the long, painful process by which humanity learned to live more safely with water and disease. We, the inheritors of that accumulated knowledge, have the privilege of clean water flowing from our taps, of swimming pools that are regularly tested and treated, of medical care that can diagnose and treat waterborne illnesses before they become fatal. These blessings, which we often take for granted, were purchased with the suffering of countless generations who did not have access to the knowledge that protects us. The Roman baths remind us that progress is not inevitable, that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, and that the institutions we create to serve us can sometimes harm us in ways we never intended. They also remind us that human beings are remarkably resilient, capable of surviving and even thriving in conditions that would seem impossible to endure. The Romans who bathed in those contaminated waters lived lives of meaning and purpose despite the constant threat of disease. creating art and literature and philosophy that still enriches our world today. As the first light of dawn breaks over the eternal city in your imagination, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the thermae, we witness a scene that captures both the tragedy and the resilience of the human spirit. The pools, still contaminated from the night's activities, begin to fill once again with hopeful bathers who believe that today might bring healing, that today the waters might finally deliver the cleanliness and health they promise. This daily renewal of hope in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary represents something profound about human nature. We are creatures who must believe in the possibility of improvement, who must trust in the institutions and practices that our society offers us, even when that trust is betrayed again and again. The Romans who returned to the baths day after day, despite witnessing the suffering of their fellow citizens, were not demonstrating stupidity or stubbornness. They were demonstrating the fundamental human need to believe that healing is possible. In your own time, you face similar challenges. You live in a world where institutions you trust may be failing you in ways you cannot see, where practices you believe are beneficial may be causing harm, where the very systems designed to protect you may be sources of danger. The story of the Roman baths is not just a tale of ancient folly. It is a mirror in which you can see the eternal human struggle to distinguish between genuine progress and the illusion of progress. But the dawn light also reveals something else, the capacity for change. Even as the bathers descend into the contaminated pools, some among them are beginning to notice patterns, to make connections, to question assumptions that have never been questioned before. A physician observes that patients who bathe frequently seem to suffer more from certain ailments than those who avoid the baths. A mother notices that her children fall ill more often after visits to the thermae. A bath attendant begins to see correlations between the cleanliness of the water and the health of the bathers. These observations, dismissed at first as coincidence or superstition, slowly accumulate into a body of evidence that cannot be ignored. Knowledge begins to spread, practices begin to change, and gradually, far too gradually for those who suffer, in the meantime improvements are made. This is how progress actually happens, not through sudden revelations or dramatic breakthroughs, but through the patient accumulation of evidence and the slow, often painful process of changing deeply held beliefs. The Romans eventually did develop better methods of water treatment and sanitation, though it took centuries and cost countless lives. The knowledge they gained through their suffering became part of the foundation upon which later civilizations built their own understanding of public health. The legacy of the Roman baths is not just one of horror and death, it is also one of hard-won wisdom that has benefited every generation since. In your own life, you are part of this same ongoing process of discovery and improvement. The choices you make, the observations you contribute, the questions you ask, all of these become part of humanity's collective effort to understand and improve the world. The suffering you may witness or experience is not meaningless if it contributes to knowledge that can prevent future suffering. The Roman baths teach us that we must remain humble about our own knowledge while continuing to strive for improvement. They remind us that the institutions we create to serve us require constant vigilance and regular reform. Most importantly, they show us that human beings are capable of learning from their mistakes, even when those mistakes are costly and painful. As the morning sun climbs higher over Rome, warming the marble facades of the thermae, and beginning another cycle of hope and disappointment, healing and harm, we can find comfort in knowing that this cycle does not repeat endlessly unchanged. Each revolution of the wheel brings new knowledge, new possibilities, new reasons for hope. The Romans who built the baths were doing their best with the knowledge they had. We honor their memory not by condemning their failures, but by learning from them and doing better with the knowledge we have gained. And now, my dear companion in this journey through time, as the sun sets once more over the 7 hills and the last bathers of the day emerge from the waters that have held so much suffering and hope, it is time for us to take our leave of ancient Rome and return to the comfort of your modern world. You have been brave to walk with me through these dark chapters of human history, to witness suffering that was both preventable and inevitable, to see how good intentions and sincere beliefs can lead to tragic consequences. The images we have shared of children dying in contaminated pools, of families destroyed by waterborne diseases, of an entire civilization slowly weakening itself through practices it believed were beneficial. These are not easy things to carry in your mind as you prepare for sleep. But I hope you will also carry with you the deeper truths we have discovered together. The Romans who suffered in those baths were not so different from you and me. They loved their families, worked to improve their circumstances, and tried to make sense of a world that often seemed hostile and unpredictable. Their failures were failures of knowledge, not of character, and their suffering contributed to the accumulated wisdom that protects you today. The clean water that flows from your taps, the sanitized pools where you swim safely, the medical knowledge that can quickly diagnose and treat waterborne illnesses, all of these benefits exist because of the painful lessons learned by generations of people who did not have access to such protections. Every time you turn on a faucet or step into a modern bath, you are benefiting from the accumulated suffering and wisdom of countless people who came before you. This does not mean you should feel guilty about your advantages, but rather grateful for them and mindful of your responsibility to use them wisely. The Romans could not have imagined the world you inhabit with its advanced understanding of sanitation and disease, just as you cannot fully imagine what future generations will think of the practices and beliefs that seem obviously correct to you today. Perhaps some future traveler through time will look back on our era with the same mixture of sympathy and horror that we feel when contemplating the Roman baths. Perhaps they will wonder how we could have been so blind to dangers that seem obvious to them, so confident in practices that they know to be harmful. This possibility should make us humble about our own certainties while encouraging us to remain open to new evidence and new ways of understanding the world. The story of the Roman baths is ultimately a story about the human conditional capacity for both great achievement and tragic error, our ability to create institutions that serve us and institutions that harm us, our tendency to mistake good intentions for good outcomes. It is a story that repeats in different forms throughout history, and it will continue to repeat as long as human beings inhabit this world. But it is also a story of hope. The Romans eventually learned from their mistakes, developed better practices, and passed their hard-won knowledge onto future generations. Progress is possible, even if it comes slowly and at great cost. The suffering we have witnessed tonight was not meaningless, became part of the long process by which humanity learns to live more safely and wisely in the world. As you prepare to sleep, let the sound of clean water running in your own home remind you of how far we have come. Let the comfort of your safe, warm bed serve as a gentle reminder of the luxury you enjoy. Not just material luxury, but the luxury of living in a time when we understand so much more about how to protect human health and well-being. Sleep well, knowing that the darkness we have explored together is in the past, and that the knowledge gained from that darkness helps to light the way forward. Dream gently of clear running water and clean, bright spaces where healing can happen safely. And when you wake tomorrow morning, Perhaps you will carry with you a deeper appreciation for the simple miracle of cleanliness and the profound responsibility we all share to protect and preserve the knowledge that keeps us safe. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of history. May your rest be peaceful, and may you wake refreshed and grateful for the blessings of the modern world that we too often take for granted. Sweet dreams, and until we meet again in another story from the past, sleep well in the comfort of your clean, safe, and wonderfully civilized world.